We're now about 1 month until Wisconsin's Supreme Court election, and the two candidates are now making the rounds, trying to raise support across the state. The candidates are Milwaukee County Judge Janet Protasiewicz and former state Supreme Court Justice Daniel Kelly. Protasiewicz leans liberal, Kelly leans conservative. Both candidates appeared at the Wisconsin Counties Association Legislative Conference in Madison this week. After their appearances, they were each asked about recusing themselves from cases. Protasiewicz said she would recuse herself from cases brought by the state Democratic Party since it has donated millions to her campaign. Kelly did not make a similar pledge for cases involving the Republican Party of Wisconsin, which has donated to his campaign.
I've been very, very clear and very, very careful that I have talked to people about what my personal values are. Every single time I talk about what my personal values are, I make sure everybody understands that I will only be making decisions based on what the law is and based on what the Constitution is. Every single decision will be rooted in the law.
You know, we oftentimes talk about that in terms of the scales of justice, and holding those straight, true, and even, and keeping your thumb off the scale, right? That's the responsibility of every justice. I have followed the rules of recusal during my service on the Supreme Court, and I intend to do that going forward.
This race is already the most expensive state Supreme Court race in U.S. history. Candidates and outside groups spent more than $9.2 million leading up to the primary, according to a tally by WizPolitics.com. And spending after the primary is already about $9.4 million, bringing the total to more than $18 million. Before this, the most expensive state Supreme Court race had been about $15 million in Illinois in 2004. And joining us now is former Wisconsin Supreme Court Justice Daniel Kelly. First off, thanks so much for joining us here today.
My pleasure, Lance. Thanks so much for having me on the show.
Well, we appreciate it. All right, so in a lot of the ads that we've seen recently, you've been labeled extreme by your opponent. In fact, I'm going to read a quote here. It says, "You were on the payroll of a radical anti-abortion group." All right, that ad is referencing the Wisconsin Right to Life. Were you ever on their payroll?
Never. Yeah, I don't know, I have any idea where that comes from, but there's not a shred of truth to it. And this idea that I'm radical, when that charge first came out when I got into the race, kind of made me chuckle, because the idea was, I suppose, they said that my views of the law were far outside the mainstream, which to me is remarkable because my view of the law is that the courts should follow it. So I think if that counts as extreme for my opponent, I think that's telling on themselves.
All right, so the Protasiewicz camp has raised and spent a lot of money. Does it concern you how much money is coming into this campaign right now?
Not really. I mean, money is a way of getting a message out. And we're going to have enough support to get our message all across the state of Wisconsin. And it's a message of constitutional fidelity, right? That's what I've done on the Supreme Court. That's what I intend to do if the people of Wisconsin return me. Now, the story that Janet's trying to sell, that's going to take a whole lot more money than I think she can raise. Because what she wants to promote is the idea that a jurist can be above the law. I mean, she's gone so far as to say she'd place her thumb on the scales of justice to make sure that cases are resolved according to her personal values. And I don't think the people of Wisconsin want any bit of that on the Wisconsin Supreme Court.
You're referencing the fact that she's talked about how she feels about abortion, redistricting. Do you believe your opponent has crossed an ethical line during this campaign?
Well, I don't want to comment on that specifically, because should the people of Wisconsin return me to the court, it may be that we'll have to review a complaint alleging ethical violations. What I can say is that this is entirely, egregiously inappropriate for a jurist to do. So the role of the court is really pretty simple. The people of Wisconsin have told us they've got one job they want us to do, just one. They want us to pay attention, do it well, but it's just one thing, and that's to use the existing law to resolve the cases that come before the court. And they tell us they're not interested in what we think of that law, whether it's good or bad, effective or not. They say they've got an entirely different branch of government to have those conversations with, and that's the legislature. So political questions get resolved in the legislature, legal questions get resolved in the courts. And my opponent is mixing those two up. She wants to bring the politics into the court to resolve cases according to political considerations rather than legal requirements.
Well, as you're talking about maybe conflict of interest here, she did say this week that she would recuse herself from any cases involving the Democratic Party because of how much money she's received. Would you recuse yourself from any cases based off of money that you received for the campaign?
Well, as with all recusal decisions, it's a case-by-case basis. So it would require considering the parties before the court, the issues presented, and whatever the factor is that someone suggests requires recusal. And my promise is to do as I have always done on the Supreme Court, and that is to consider recusal decisions seriously and act appropriately. I've recused myself in the past when it's been required, and I would do that in the future if it should come up.
All right, now you mentioned that she mentioned how she might vote or her personal feelings on a lot of these issues. She's also said that she kind of guarantees how you would vote on abortion if you were elected when it comes to the abortion ban, that you would uphold that.
Yeah.
What is your response to that?
She's pretending. She has no idea. So my obligation and my commitment has always been to follow the law. Now, here's the way you can tell that I did it and will continue to do it. I've already served on the Supreme Court. I've had a number of years of service to the people of Wisconsin in that capacity, and every opinion that I wrote on the Supreme Court, we've got that listed on my campaign website. That's justicedanielkelly.com, by the way. And I list them there because I want the people of Wisconsin to be able to look at the work that I did on their behalf and to know and to be able to see that what I did was resolve cases according to the law without respect to my personal views or personal politics, because that's the role of the court. So Janet thinks that she knows how I will rule because she's telling on herself. She knows that she's going to resolve cases politically if she makes it to the Supreme Court, so she just assumes that everyone else will do that too. And that's just not true. My history is fidelity to the Constitution, fidelity to the rule of law, and that brings faithfulness to the people of Wisconsin.
So many of the headlines of this campaign and some of the ads are about one issue in particular. It's about abortion. Are you concerned that this has become almost a singular issue driving this whole race right now?
Well, the thing that concerns me is that a lot of the conversations about this race are framed in political terms. And whether it's that issue or any other, the problem is the court does not do politics. At least it's not supposed to. So, the Constitution makes a very clear distinction between the courts and the legislature when it comes to political questions. Politics are for the legislature, but politics in the court, that's poison. That destroys people's sense of justice and even calls into question whether justice is possible in our judicial system. So my concern is that we talk about the court. We talk about legal issues. We talk about jurisprudence. We talk about qualification, understanding of the law, and commitment to those principles. That's what this conversation, this campaign should be about. And I invite my opponent to join in that conversation, because this is the proper conversation to have. But we should not be talking about politics regardless of how salient those issues might be.
You have been in this position before in a campaign like this. In 2020, you lost your seat. What did you learn from that race that maybe you're doing different this time around?
Yeah, so a couple of things. Probably the most important is this. It turns out that Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders combined can turn out more votes than me. Well, still hurts to admit that, but it could hardly be any other way. Two presidential candidates are always going to be able to turn out more votes than a state Supreme Court candidate. But the other thing we learned is I attracted nearly 700,000 votes that year. And if you set aside years in which there was a presidential primary on the same day as the Supreme Court election, there's only one justice in the history of the state who received as many votes as I did. So before deciding to run in this race, I looked at the calendar real carefully. And what I found is there are no presidential primaries anywhere in sight. So I think we're going to be good on April 4th.
Now, I asked Janet Protasiewicz last week on this show, so I'll ask you the same question here. What does the Supreme Court look like if you are elected?
It looks like a court that follows the law, that is faithful to the Constitution, that constrains itself to questions of law rather than politics. And that is the guarantee of justice in our judicial system. If you start incorporating politics, it destroys the very concept of justice. So with me on the court, it will look as it did when I was there before, a consistent and insistent commitment to the Constitution and the law.
And finally, I'll ask you this. Are you concerned about how much outside money has come into this race from outside the state of Wisconsin?
Not terribly. Money is there just to get the message out, and I want all of Wisconsin to hear exactly what I'm saying and exactly what Janet's saying. She's been most insistent about her desire to place herself above the law, and I want everyone in Wisconsin to hear that. So the more money that comes in to amplify her message of putting herself above the law, that works for me.
All right. Well, we want to thank you so much for the time here today. We really appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Lance.